So then, here we are continuing on from the last video and taking a look at interior lighting. What we're going to see is that an awful lot of stuff is very much the same as we saw in the last video. A lot of the ways of working are the same. We're just going to be using some slightly different light types. So first thing I wanted to do, just to get it out the way, is to look at, some of the equivalencies with what we saw previously. So that we can see how that all works. So you can see that I've got an interior here and I've got a simple environment. I'm just using sun sky. We could be using an HDR or some such, but for this I'm just going to be using that. And you see I've got a bunch of lights set up which are currently all disabled, and I'm using GI here. So we're using sample backdrop GI, one bounce of course, so that it approximates what you would get with a singular light. And of course that is rendering away there. So there's our finished render with just the background GI, okay, and we can see what we've got. 133 seconds it's taken to render this, and as you can see it is fairly noisy. So let's look at what we saw last time, how we can go with environmental lighting, because of course one thing that might immediately spring to mind that's going to be a quick and easy way to light an interior is to simulate this whole backdrop radiosity thing, right? We've got the windows where the backdrop light can come in, so why not just disable GI and use an environment light, because of course that will, send lighting into the room through the open windows, so we can do it that way. And there we go, 88 seconds, so quite a significant time saving, 30%-ish time saving, roughly 1/3 quicker. And we can see obviously it's still quite noisy. It's a little bit less noisy than the GI alone was, even though we can see that they're both running 12 samples, 12 rays, whatever you want to call it there. So clearly that is an option. If you want to work in this way, you can just use an environment light, but we see the same rule that we saw before coming into play. It is better to use direct lighting than it is to use background GI. Rendering interiors, exteriors, basically background GI is largely pointless from a time quality perspective. The main thing that having background GI, you might wonder why we even have it. Well, it's kind of lazy, isn't it? Because if you're trying to do a GI lit scene, rather than fiddling around with your lights and whatnot, you can just slap on background GI and save yourself time setting up the scene and just sacrifice the time in the amount of time it's going to take to render. That of course might depend on your own workflow. If you're just wanting to bang scenes out and you've got a gazillion cores and you don't care about render time, then maybe you can just go with background GI because you can chew through it. Otherwise, if you want a single workstation or maybe, just 2 or 3 computers that you use as a farm, then the amount of time that you spend setting things up with lighting, you will save multiples of when it comes to render time. And in that case, background GI is basically pointless in every situation. So that seems great, but it's not the final story, because what we also have here, if I just switch over to our wireframe view, you can see that I have all of these lights in the window holes, which are of course area light types, and you'll notice that they are all set to portal. We should recall that a portal light is kind of like a cookie cutter light into the backdrop. To that extent, it functions much like an environment light does, except it's only a section rather than a complete surround. If you imagine adding a whole bunch of portal area lights and arranging them so that they formed a kind of a sphere made out of panels, that would pretty much be an environment light. So let's kill off our environment. Let's turn all of these lights here on, and let's make sure that each and all of those are also set to 12 samples, and let's do our render. Okay, and there we go. Look at that, far cleaner, really good. 220 seconds, so that's taken longer than even the background GI did. But of course you can probably see that some of that is owing to the quality of the lighting here. Yes, it's taken longer, but we've got a lot less noise, so you kind of expect that. Now, part of that, of course, is because of the sampling. You know, I've still used the 12 samples, but I've got 5 lights. So I've got this one being sampled 12 times and this one being sampled 12 times. Let's have a look at what we get if we sort of balance it back down. Stupidly, I've gone and used 12 when I've got 5 lights. I should have chosen an even division of 5, shouldn't I? What's 12 divided by 5? 2.4. So let's take all 5 lights here and give them, let's say, 2 samples instead. This, of course, is now much lower than we had for the GI or the environment light, but whilst we've only got 2 samples on each light, we do have 5 of them, so it's 10 samples. We can think of it, that's not actually how the renderer works under the hood, but as a rough rule of thumb, it's a fine little bit of arithmetic. So we can say that this is roughly equivalent to having a 10 sample environment light or a 10 sample GI, 10 ray GI. But we can see, even as it's rendering here, that it is coming up much more cleanly. So we'll just wait for that to finish. And there we go, 73.89 seconds. So quicker than the environment light and substantially cleaner, and technically speaking with fewer samples. This then gives us our next rule in the set. We started out by pointing out that, of course, background GI, pointless to use. You get better results with an environment light. That, of course, goes for exteriors. Now we're on to interiors. What do we want to use? We want to use area lights set to be portals. So these are the simple rules for doing your exterior or environmental or interior lighting. Forget background GI. For exteriors or environments, use an environment light. For interiors, use portal lights. Following these rules will always give you the best quality per amount of render time. The other stuff that we pointed out, of course, to do with the shading model carries exactly the same with working with portal lights or area lights. If you remember back in the video when we talked about the shading model and we showed how having the lights as visible to camera when it was in area mode as well as environment mode, or for the same for other lights, then you've got the refractions with ray trace only, reflections with ray trace only, glossy reflections on, so on and so forth. That still carries over exactly the same. And the other thing to remember when using portal lights is, of course, that the amount of light that comes into an interior is dependent upon the size of the window, right? If you've got a room with a tiny little porthole, then it's very dimly lit. If you have the same room with great big, floor to ceiling sort of bay windows, then lots of light comes in and it's very bright. Therefore, the amount of light coming from the portal lights must be dependent on the area of the window. What does that mean? It means when you are using portal lighting, have the normalize option over here turned off. Because, as we should recall from the lighting and intensity video, the normalize option on area lights changes them between, the lux value, which is, of course, the amount of lighting per square meter. And that, of course, is what you want here with your portal lights. You want them to emit a certain amount of light per unit area going with the size of the window holes. Now, another thing that you can see that I've got in this scene that I do want to mention when it comes to interior lighting is I've got a light here called Sun, which is a distant light. Now, in this particular example, I'm using the Sun Sky plugin. That gives you this sort of, sky backdrop. It is intended to be used with a direct, or should I say distant light that is emulating the sun. If you're using an HDR environment that's of course got a very bright sun disk in it, then you might not need to do that. That'll depend upon exactly what your backdrop is like. If you're using a gradient, just a simple Lightwave gradient, then of course you don't have a sun object. For an interior like this, at least an interior that's being done in the daytime, and the same would go for an exterior, of course, then you probably would want a sunlight of some type. So let's turn that going. We can see there that I've got a simple direct light, distant light, and that's coming in, and I've got a bit of an angle on it just to give it slightly softened edges. And of course you can adjust the brightness value of that to match the kind of lighting that you're intending to have, how bright a day it is, how bright your sun is. And of course that plays in just fine with the portal lights that we've got here. We don't need to alter those in any way. Beyond this though, of course, the next step is global illumination. Just as we saw in the exterior or environmental lighting video, we can now still use GI, we just don't use it in backdrop mode. And of course, then we get GI that comes into the second bounce. The portal lights, and in this case my sunlight, those are providing my, in inverted commas, first bounce, which is of course, you know, good quality, fast, brute force, so to speak. My GI is then, of course, picking up the subsequent bounces. It means I can use fewer GI bounces, so if I was wanting the equivalent of 3 bounce GI, I can go for 2 diffuse bounces here. When lighting this way for interiors, I should point out 2 to 3 bounces is just about the most you'll ever need. Anything more than that, and the bounce light becomes so weak after so many multiple bounces that it's almost invisible, unless you're intending on doing some extreme re-exposure or tone mapping later on in the, you know, post process. There's almost no reason to go beyond 2 or maximum 3 bounces when you're lighting interiors in this way. And of course, as we saw in the last video, it gives us the ability to use interpolated radiosity, because we can use that with pretty smoothed out settings. And if we just switch over to the diffuse indirect, then of course we can get a quick look at how that is going to come out. And there we go, we see that coming together there, the interpolated bounces. That is of course just the secondary bounce light. Pretty clean, not particularly noisy, not very splotchy, but then we have got quite broad settings. Again, we'll look at that later, but it's reasonably good enough. And of course, if we just go back to the final render, so we get both initial direct lighting and the radiosity coming together. There we go, 135 seconds, that's giving us 2 bounce GI, all our direct lighting, really clean, noise-free, pretty nice stuff. And of course the render time there, only a scotch longer, only about 10 seconds longer, what is it, 12, 13 seconds longer than we had with single bounce brute force backdrop GI. So not only do we have a nice quality render coming out here, we've got a pretty well optimized render time as well. So once again, let us just break down the rules. Pretty much forget using backdrop GI unless you're being lazy in your setup and you don't care about your render times. Otherwise, use environment lights if you're doing exteriors, use portal lights if you're doing interiors. Make sure portals have their normalize turned off. Make sure that specular and visible to camera are on, whether you're using portals or environments. And remember the elements of the shading model where we use ray trace only for basically all of our surfaces. Follow those few simple things and you will get the best quality renders in the shortest render time. Of course, at this point, some of you might be cleverly pointing out, what the hell, RH, you don't do much architectural rendering. It's not the case that we always have a render that is either an interior or an exterior. Sometimes we're showing, you know, a building in a surrounding and it's shot from outside, so it's an exterior, but hey, guess what? You've got these big bay windows and you want to be seeing inside the building as well. And so we've got a single shot that has both interior elements and exterior elements. What do we do then? Well, there's 2 ways to take care of it. First of all, you can treat it all as if it were an exterior environmental shot and just go with the environment light. Kick up the samples a little bit to improve the render quality of the light that goes to the inside of the building. The other way, if you want to take a little more time, create more optimization, better quality lighting, shorter render times, and so on, again, spending a little bit of time in the setup can save you time on the render, is to break up your model into different sections, where basically you have one bit of mesh, which is all of the exterior stuff. So that's, you know, trees or cars or whatever is outside, plus the outside geometry of the building. And then other elements, which are all the inside parts of the building. And what you simply do in that case is you have an environment light, and we use the exclusions. So of course the object here, layer 1, that's the inside stuff. Layer 2 is the outside stuff. So if we take our environment light, we want to have the interior stuff excluded from that. We've then got 2 portal lights here. What do we want to exclude? Well, we want to exclude the outside stuff from those portal lights. As a consequence, we get a render where our exterior elements are being entirely dealt with by the environment light, and the interior elements are being entirely dealt with by the portal lights. But of course, in terms of the render that you get out, the light appears fully continuous. And of course, because the portal lights are just taking from whatever backdrop that we've decided to use, gradient, HDR, sun, sky, what have you, exactly the same as the environment light does, then, you know, the lighting of a sun or bright, dark areas and so on and so forth, they are in sync with one another. So you're not having to, you know, match some sort of rotation between one projection and another. It all just comes from the singular backdrop, and you get something that gives you the best of both worlds. And of course, once again, we can come over and use our GI here to add in the additional bounces that we might want, whether that be, of course, just going full brute force, or of course going interpolated if we want to have something that's a little less detailed in the secondary bounces, but otherwise still good in terms of our actual lighting. Then we get that advantage as well. So there we have it. That pretty much details all there is about the different kinds of lighting scenarios that we're going to encounter, things that are fully environmental, fully interior, or indeed perhaps renders that are a mix of both, or where our camera is able to view an exterior scene and an interior scene. Here's how we can match it all up, get our surfaces set for the correct model, use the right kind of lights, set our samples in the right kind of ways, get our GI into play and all of it, and get nicely optimized renders that are clean and that are quick and that are lovely.